this is Nathan Quinn with Clover Defense, and today's episode we will be discussing a few topics, be covering PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Before I go any further, just going to preface this video the same way I preface all the other videos by saying that I'm not a medical professional, I am not a medical provider, I am just me sharing my experiences and what I have learned and what worked for me and what didn't. So, post-traumatic stress disorder usually manifests as disturbing thoughts or feelings related to an experience or a witnessed traumatic event. And I think contemporarily, a lot of people associate PTSD with military and to some extent law enforcement, but that doesn't necessarily mean those are the only two demographics of people that can experience PTSD. You can experience PTSD from a natural disaster, a serious accident like a motor vehicle accident, or sexual violence or history. So I think the key takeaway is that these thoughts and feelings persist long after that event has taken place. I remember reading somewhere, don't quote me, but approximately 3.5% of US adults experience PTSD. So like 1 in 11 people will experience PTSD at some point in their lifetime. Now, me personally, I don't think I've never been diagnosed with PTSD, and I don't think that's what I was dealing with me personally. But given those statistics, right, especially because my primary audience for these videos is military, law enforcement, first responders, I think it's worth bringing up. Because even though I personally don't have experience with it, it's a very common cognitive injury that a lot of other folks experience. And so I felt that it was worth talking about. That said, because I have such a limited / non-existent experience with PTSD, it's going to be very short. So that's why I'm doing both, multiple things, so PTSD and depression and anxiety, and I wanted to do depression and anxiety together because in my experience those things often travel alongside one another. So again, just to reiterate, it's not uncommon for people not in the military or law enforcement to have experienced PTSD. You don't have to be in one of those two organizations to experience it. You could just be regular Joe Schmo, and that's perfectly fine. And again, these things that I've heard other people talk about, things that worked for them as far as PTSD, I want to reiterate, I personally have not dealt with this. And so in the interest of, not trying to tip into medical advice, because this is not based off my own anecdotal experience, I'm going to limit the recommendations to this. So, I've heard guys say, don't isolate yourself, talk to somebody. And I understand that for some people, this is hard, right? Whatever event that you're dealing with, it's obviously causing you some sort of emotional discomfort or stress, and so it's probably not an easier conversation to have. So even if it's starting out with a small conversation, and it takes multiple iterations of small conversations to build up to, hey, this is what's going on, this is what I'm experiencing, and why. Another thing that I've seen guys try, or I've heard of guys trying, if they don't, particularly if they don't want to have a conversation with somebody else, which again, I totally understand, you could try journaling it out. Kind of the same way with the intrusive thoughts, just get what you're feeling, your emotions, and your thoughts, just get it out of your head and onto paper. Um, you know, it also helps you not only get it out of your head, but it will help you process it because now you're reading it, right? And it also forces your brain to slow down. I don't know if you've ever experienced, um, I liken it to playing pinball, where you go from one thought to the next, and before you know it, you're from A to B to X to Z, and you don't even know how you got to X. I mean, obviously there was a whole sequence of thoughts that led to that point. You probably didn't just jump from B to X, but sometimes our brains move so quickly. And this I have experienced, not related to PTSD, but I've experienced it with my own thoughts that, one thought after another, and then boom, before I know it, I'm at, I went from A to B to C to Z, and I'm like, how the hell am I at Z right now? Like, what happened? But because it happened so quickly, you don't notice that process occurring. But if you write your thoughts out, that forces your brain to slow down versus just, doing this little pinball mechanism all the way to, whatever that final thought is. Um, and I think, you know, one of the other things you could look at doing is consider, if you're experiencing PTSD, consider adjusting your lifestyle. Um, I've seen guys say like, hey, I stopped drinking alcohol because typically PTSD and alcohol don't mix well together. I definitely did that with my depression. Maybe limit your caffeine consumption, increase your sleep, try to focus on things that genuinely bring you joy or make you happy. And then, lastly, I think one of the best things to do is just reframe how you're looking at PTSD. And it's like, hey, it's not this illness, it's not this mental deficiency, it's just a cognitive injury. Like everything else we've been talking about up to this point, just look at it like uh, a cognitive injury, right? It's nothing more than that. And I think, alongside, depression and mental health and behavioral health or whatever you have it, I think PTSD has developed a challenging connotation, I'll put it that way, to where, people don't want to be labeled as, oh man, he's got PTSD or I've got PTSD. Nobody wants that. Because of I think the implications or, the perceived shame. So, excuse me, um, helping reframing how you look at it as a cognitive injury might help alleviate some of that stress, and again, may ultimately remove some of those roadblocks that prevent you from having those conversations and talking to somebody about it. And again, it doesn't even need to be a medical professional or medical provider that you want to talk to. Pick a trusted confidant. If you have a spouse, pick a spouse. You have a best friend, pick a best friend. If you're religious, go talk to your spiritual leader. It doesn't have to be a medical person, right? Maybe it works its way to that point, but just starting out, yeah, I mean, you don't have to go find a nurse or a doc or a psych and be like, hey, this is, spill my guts. This is what I've got going on. Just start small. Talk to somebody that you trust and that you have confidence in having that conversation with. So yeah, that covers PTSD. And in fact, because I have such a limited experience with it, in the comment section below, if you as a viewer have had experiences with PTSD or somebody who has, feel free to add in your 2 cents. Like, hey, this is what worked for my friend or my spouse, or this is what worked for me when I was experiencing it. Share that information so that, we can help each other out. So next, we're going to go into depression. So depression is usually defined as like a common and serious illness that negatively affects how you feel and how you think and how you act. Symptoms can include, and I hate using like the word itself in the definition, but like a sad or a depressed mood, loss of interest or pleasure in doing things, increases or decreases in weight, usually to the extreme measure. So not like, a pound here, a pound there. It's like, gaining 10 pounds or losing 10 pounds in quick order, short order, trouble sleeping, fatigue, just tired, lethargic, feeling worthless, feeling guilty, um, you know, having a lot of trouble concentrating, and it could end with thoughts about death or suicide. And so, from my experience, there was not a point where it was just like a light bulb got turned on or off, right? To me, my depression was a gradual thing. And again, I didn't know what was happening at the time. I wasn't really paying attention to it. I wasn't looking for signs and symptoms of depression. But it was a gradual thing over weeks and months of just building on itself. And, I remember after the fact talking to my wife, and she was like, yeah, I noticed a change in your behavior. So much so that she commented that post initializing my treatment, she noted that, like, hey, I'm starting to see like shades of you coming back, like the old you. And I remember talking to my team sergeant after the fact, and he was like, yeah, I was like, hey, I was trying to do the best I could to mask it, and, deal with it on my own, didn't want to bother the team. And he was like, yeah, we kind of noticed something was different. We weren't sure what was going on, but like the team did notice. And so, to me, I thought like, I'm doing a good job masking this. Nobody knows. Like, well, okay, people knew. So that change in behavior and that demeanor usually is noticeable by somebody. So, saying that to say, if you are a person who's got a significant other or someone in your life and you start to notice a shift in their behavior, even if it's subtle, but if it's continued and, prolonged, maybe engage them a little bit and check in on them and see how they're doing. I remember at one point thinking that, and again, this was based off of contrasting how I started to notice things after the diagnosis and after I started treatment compared to things that I noticed before, right? So one of the things I noticed was things just seemed duller. And I mean that to like, it's almost like there was this filter over my vision where, colors were subdued, all my senses, everything was just kind of like muted a little bit. It seemed almost like darker, and it almost seemed like my vision, right, I was always looking down, or, for maybe like horizon level down. It's almost like everything that occurred up here in my peripheral vision just didn't really register. It was like kind of like a gray, like I didn't notice it to the point where I was like, hey, what's going on with my vision? Why is there like this visor over the top part of my peripheral vision? But looking back at it, I was like, man, for the life of me, it seemed like everything up here was cut off. And I was just focusing on, forward and down. I don't know why that is. And again, I didn't really notice that while I was in the depths of my depression. I didn't notice it until I started taking the medication and I saw the change. And I remember very distinctly, starting to take the medication, the first 2 weeks of meds that they put me on, it was like somebody just cranked up the brightness volume. Like suddenly this, that visor that was on the top part of my peripheral vision was gone. And it was, obviously the sun's in the sky, so like all that light's coming in from the top, and I'm like, what the heck, dude? Like colors were brighter. It was almost like my vision was kind of like this the whole time. And I wasn't walking around for months like this, but that's kind of how it was almost kind of perceived. And then it was like suddenly now my eyes were wide open. And I don't think the medication really had any sort of impact on the width of my eyelids or whether or not my brow was furrowed. I think it was just perception. Things seemed sharper. I could notice more detail again in my peripheral vision. Depression almost kind of seemed to like get me in like some sort of like tunnel vision, um, or at least like that was all I really was paying attention to. So just interesting to look at that physiological component to it. Um, Another thing that I didn't realize at the time was that I had a misconception, and I think a lot of people do, that depression just means you're sad all the time, right? I'm always sad, and that really wasn't the case for me. It was more apathy. I didn't feel anything. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel happy either. I was just like flat. Like nothing really impacted me emotionally. Things that would make me sad didn't make me sad. Things that would have made me happy didn't make me happy. It was just like it's almost like a TV show you're watching the monitor and the heart rate beeps and it just flatlines. Like it was just like beep. Um, and that's kind of to me towards the tail end of my journey before treatment. That's when I started to register like, hey, something is different, something is not right. Because I remember distinctly coming home from my third deployment, and previously when I came home from my deployments, I was just so happy to see my wife. I just wanted to see her again and to hold her and to be with her, and I just couldn't get off that plane fast enough, right? Um, and then I distinctly remember walking into the baggage claim area of the airport and seeing my wife there, pregnant with our son, and I was just like, be, and I'm like waiting there for the suspense of like the flood of emotion to hit me, and be like, oh, I'm home again, I miss my wife. Nada. And I was just like, this isn't good. Like, in the past, I'm like, yeah, all right, I'm gonna go home and see my wife and get to be with her again and get out of this shithole country. But like, this time, not so much. And so that, to me, that was kind of like the final red flag. Like, yeah, this isn't, you know, fictitious. It's a real thing. And to that point, um, let's see. I'll have a graph pop up here. There has been some research now that shows there are physiological changes that happen to the body, to the brain in particular, when you are depressed. Um, like, so kind of going back to that trope, it's like, oh, it's all in your head. Like, well, it is. And it's both figurative and literal. Um, so you can see the scan here that a depressed brain looks different than a non-depressed brain. Um, and so what that information showed me, and what I hope it shows you, is that there are a lot of components of depression that are not they're not under your control. You can't your degree of influence over these things is very limited. A bunch of neurochemicals at play that change your brain's chemistry. You can't truly control that, maybe as much as you would like. Um, Certainly there's medications, there's lifestyle changes, diet might have an impact on it. I don't know. I'm not, like I said, not a medical professional. But it's worth noting that like, hey, depression is not some like made up fictitious thing. Like there is like evidence of a physical change happening in your body. Um, and some of that could be the result of stress that you have experienced. Um, Again, like you could experience a stressor, your body goes through these physiological changes, your brain's chemistry, your neurochemicals change, and now you're depressed, or you've entered a depressed state. Um, and depression is a very common thing, right? A lot of people experience depression. Not a whole lot of people talk about it. Some people experience depression and they're never clinically diagnosed and they live their lives just fine. Some people don't experience depression until a later time. Some people live with it their whole lives. There's no real, at least to my knowledge, like there's no real like rhyme or reason to it. It just happens. Um, and I'll put some numbers up here for you guys to see, but like it is statistically like very common. And so if you do struggle with depression, if that is something you're dealing with, you're not alone. A lot of people deal with it. So like this notion that it's somehow abnormal or deficient or less than, like, well, actually it's the average human experience probably involves depression at some point. Um, so a couple things that I used to deal with, or to help me work through my depression. Um, so first thing was try to identify the root cause of this depression. Um, Sometimes, not always, if I started feeling that apathy and just meh, I started to look around at my life, sometimes physically, and like, okay, hey, what is there a catalyst? Is there some sort of change in my environment or something that occurred that is serving as a catalyst for this depression? Um, and the reason why that was important for me was it helped me understand the why, right? Like, oh, hey, this is happening. All right, that is probably contributing to my depression. Um, and that helped alleviate some of like the fear of the unknown. Like, why is this happening to me? What's going on? Versus like, oh yeah, no, no shit. Like, I see now why I'm depressed. Like, that makes sense. Cool. And that kind of removed some of the anxiety that came along with being depressed. Um, Another big thing is, don't self-isolate. When I was depressed, I didn't want to do anything other than just sit in bed, or lay in bed rather, and just do nothing. I just wanted to sleep. I was exhausted all the time. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to work out. I didn't want to engage with anybody. I just wanted to sleep. Mostly just because I wanted it to go away. And so my theory was like, well, if I just lay here, eventually it'll resolve itself, right? I had zero energy. Um, and I didn't want to talk to my wife about it because she was pregnant at the time, but like I also just didn't want to burden her with this, like, hey, by the way, your husband's got depression and he's dealing with this. Um, and so, I'm laying in bed by myself in my head with my thoughts, and that is probably the worst place somebody could be when they're dealing with depression, really any kind of injury, but like self-isolating, choosing to isolate yourself and try to, keep this all in your head, not a great space. And again, kind of touching on what I talked about previously, previous episodes, by talking to my wife about it, it gave me a sense of security because, it created sort of a safety net of, okay, hey, yes, I'm dealing with this, but my wife knows it's going on. She's keeping an eye on me so she can, if something starts really changing, she can intervene and be like, hey, Nate, what's going on? Like, you look in some kind of way. And, again, the more people I told, the more layered those security nets became. I had to, find new hobbies and relax. And I say new hobbies because, the two hobbies I like doing the most, shooting competitively and snowboarding, at the time weren't really available to me because, snowboarding is a winter sport. This was the fall in North Carolina, so not a whole lot of snow to go around. And then shooting was not really an option for me at the time because I had chosen to remove my guns from the house. So I had to come up with new hobbies and things for me to do other than sit there with my thoughts. So I started to, get back to my high school days where I would just doodle random pictures and write creative stories. And it's actually, the writing portion is actually what helped to lead me to start writing a book and then led to these videos. So it all kind of worked out. Um, also try to employ that changing of the mindset by choosing more carefully the words I used to describe what I was going through, how I was feeling. I tried to change my verbiage from, I'm coping with depression or managing uh, my depression to, working through it. Instead of making it seem like it's some sort of negative thing that I am forced to contend with. Um, I also found that like when I would enter a depressed state in my head, I would generate a lot of like negative stories, like self stories, or negative thoughts. Sometimes not true. Um, and I would daydream, for lack of a better term, about positive stories in my life, positive things that had happened, whether that happened because of me or happened to me, to help counter that negative narrative that the depressed brain was trying to generate. Um, and I also told myself like, you know, it's okay to feel negative emotions, right? If you feel sad, if you feel anxious, or you feel nothing, you feel depressed, like that's okay. You can feel negative emotions. They're not bad. They're just not pleasant, if that makes sense. And so I try to tell myself like, hey, you know, it's okay to feel this. I remember reading a book where the guy, My Friend Panic, I think I talked about that on a um, previous episode, where the guy talked about how he would start panicking over stuff, and he went from trying to resist this panic to inviting it in, to being like, hey, panic, come on in, take a seat on the sofa, get you a drink. And I try to capture that and employ it with these negative emotions, like, oh, hey, I'm feeling depressed. Hey, come on in, like, it's okay. One of the ways I tried to look at it was the emotions are here for a reason, and it's helping shape me, and I get to choose how it shapes me. I can't choose what emotions I'm feeling always. I can't force that, but I can choose how it shapes me, and I can choose how I respond. And so helping frame that to work through the depression, I think was I think very helpful. Um, Another thing to consider is cognitive behavioral therapy. Um, it could be through a professional, or it could be self-led. There's like self-help books on Amazon that you could look at. There's workbooks, and I found that, especially given my temperament of, I need to fix this problem. This is an injury. I need to do my rehab so I can get better. Having those CBT workbooks was helpful to me initially, where I was like, it gave me the feeling like, okay, hey, I am actively working towards improving this. Like if I do enough of these workbook exercises, it'll make me better. Was that actually true? Probably not. Did it help provide me some comfort at the time during my initial phase of treatment? Yeah. So, that's something else to consider, getting a CBT workbook if you don't want to go do it through a provider. Um, the reality is that depression, just like a lot of other cognitive injuries, like every other cognitive injury, is hard to quantify in terms of recovery. Um, I know I've said it before, where it's not like a physical injury where you can say, hey, 2 months in a cast, or 8 weeks, or whatever, in this many reps, like you'll be better. Um, even years later, right? So this all started for me in like started in 2021, got my diagnosis got my diagnosis in 2021, probably started in 2020. So it's coming up on 6 years later, right? There are still periods of time where I slip into depressive episodes or depressive states. I'm not clinically depressed, because it's not a constant, continuous, all day, every day impacts my day to day, But there are periods of time where it's like, oh, you know what, I wake up today and I'm just meh, don't feel anything. And I would venture to say that that's always probably been the case. Because if you think about it, right, we've all talked about, we have these days like, man, I just woke up on the wrong side of the bed today. Today just sucks. Like, I don't know why. Like, I just woke up today and just like, fuck today. The difference is now that I'm painfully aware of it, right? But sometimes these depressive states just show up for no reason. Sometimes there's a catalyst. Sometimes they last for a couple hours. Sometimes they last for a few days. But they always end. And so, like, understanding that and understanding, like, okay, I am no longer clinically depressed, but I can still enter depressed states, and that's okay. It's not backsliding, and like, counter to what I might feel, where it's like, oh my God, this is, this is alarming because, it's been such a long hiatus from depression. One of the ways I counter that is to be like, hey, you've seen this before. Like, you've been through this before. This is nothing new. It's a natural occurrence. And, to be fair, depression sometimes is an appropriate emotional response, right? I've said it before and I'll say it again. Being a Bengals fan post Super Bowl can be a depressing thing. That's an appropriate emotional response, I think. So don't be afraid of it, I guess is my point. So the next thing I'll cover is anxiety. All right. And anxiety is it's a persistent or an excessive worry like that interferes with your day to day, and it affects you in your daily activities. Can sometimes be accompanied by physical symptoms like restlessness, sweating, high blood pressure, elevated heart rate. You're feeling on edge, very jumpy, startled. Conversely, you might also just be fatigued because you're on edge the whole time and your body can't maintain that. You might have trouble sleeping, might have trouble concentrating. I think the most common one is generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. And that, kind of like depression, that's pretty common, at least in the US. Like, that's not an anomaly as far as cognitive injuries go. I think I read somewhere that like 3 and some change percent of the US population experiences anxiety, but a lot of people, myself included, just don't get treatment for it. And some of them are fine. Some of them just live their day and deal with it. Some people can't. So one of the things I noticed was that anxiety walked hand in hand with depression. And I could count on, with like 99.9% certainty that, if I entered a depressed state or I was feeling depressed, I was like, anxiety's coming. Like, and sure enough, and again, it was like this cycle where it fed on itself. Like, I was anxious because I was feeling depressed and I didn't want to feel depressed. And then I was depressed because I was anxious. And so it's just this circle that just fed off itself and fed off each other. Sometimes, from a medicine perspective, from a pharmaceutical perspective, the treatment can be the same. I have 2 separate medications, one for the depression and one for the anxiety. And it was interesting because I didn't even get the anxiety one until 2024. So I was on the antidepressant med for about 2 years, and then talked to a new provider when I left the Army, and he was like, hey, I was telling him, hey, this is what I'm feeling, this is what's going on. He's like, have you ever tried this? And I was like, no, I have not. Okay, hey, let's try that. And then I've been on it ever since. I know sometimes for me it was hard to tell which one I was experiencing, right? Was it anxiety or was it depression? especially when I was in the middle of it, right? And so one of the ways I tried to look at it to help me understand, like, what is this? And maybe it's both sometimes. Anxiety made me full of doubt, right? Like wondering, am I going to be okay? I was worried, am I going to be okay? Depression was, I don't care either way, right? So anxiety is, I don't know if I can handle this. And depression is, I don't care if I can handle this, if that makes any sense. So that methodology, I guess that like framework of trying to define depression and anxiety was helpful to me to help, like, okay, what am I dealing with? What am I in the middle of right now? And like depression, anxiety is perfectly normal, right? Like it's a normal human experience. Like at a certain point, some anxiety is healthy, right? Like anxiety helps you, I think, activate your senses, right? Put you in fight or flight mode, and sometimes that's useful, right? So like if you're about to take an exam or a final or a midterm, you should be a little bit anxious. If you're about to jump out of an airplane for the first time, you should be anxious. That is a healthy emotional response. So, again, going back to like, oh, I don't want to feel these emotions, right, was something I was dealing with. It took a while for me to register, like, hey, anxiety is actually okay in moderation, right? It's appropriate. You watch Joe Burrow get sacked and you start getting anxious because you're like, oh God, is he hurt again? Oh no, there goes the season. That's an appropriate emotional response. It is when anxiety becomes persistent or manifests over things that wouldn't normally make you anxious. It's like getting in the shower, right? If you get anxious about getting in the shower for whatever reason, if you've never been anxious about getting in the shower before, I'm using that as an example, then maybe you're experiencing a cognitive injury. So like, for me, that happened. I remember being in the shower at one point and being like, man, I am anxious as shit. But it was mostly because my wife had gone back to work and I was home alone by myself during the initial phases of my treatment. And that, for whatever reason, that was a significant emotional event because like I'm unsupervised and I'm dealing with depression and intrusive thoughts and anxiety and I don't know what's going on. And now I'm by myself. What if something happens? And I'm like, dude, I jumped out of an airplane at 12,500 feet. Like, why am I anxious about being home alone in a shower right now? And I remember like checking my pulse and it was like 120 beats per minute. And I was like, what the fuck? I'm standing in a shower. So it's okay. It happens. It's just funny. So treatment for anxiety that I tried. One of the things I did, and it was hard, was I like reduced slash significantly reduced my caffeine consumption. I wanted to do whatever I could to try to relax, and caffeine obviously is the opposite of that. So I still had coffee, but like when I was doing my workouts, no more pre-workout. So I did all my workouts raw, which sucked. That also meant no more afternoon mochas or, again, any caffeine really, but like after 12 p.m. afternoon, no less. And I usually do my workouts in the morning around like 5:30, and so caffeine was like necessary to get me up to go. But I was more committed to reducing that caffeine intake than I was trying to get a good workout in. I downloaded a yoga app, started trying to do some yoga to help me relax. I already had a membership to Massage Envy for deep tissue muscle massages, so I made it a point to be more proactive and get more of those. One of the things I definitely did was, you remember I talked about how depression made me not want to do anything and just sit there. Like I made sure to continue my exercise regimen, even if I didn't feel like it, especially in the absence of pre-workout. It's like, hey man, this is, gym is not an option. Workout is not an option. That's non-negotiable. That has to happen. So much so that, I remember one of my providers telling me like, that's good. Keep doing that. And if you ever stop, let us know. And so that became kind of a check for me. It's like, hey, am I still hitting the gym? Okay, cool. Also tried doing mindfulness. I downloaded a mindfulness app and tried that. Um, Mindfulness came with some breathing exercises. I tried that. I tried, and I'm not listing all these things as if like this didn't work, this didn't work. They all were helpful. I used all of them. I also had a grounding technique where if I got caught in this spiral of anxiety, as I came to describe it, it's just the spiral that I can't get out of, this vortex. Um, I used a grounding technique like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, where it was, name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can smell, 2 things you can touch, and like 1 thing you can taste. And what that did was help bring me back to the here and now and focus on, what's going on in front of me, vice being in my head in this vortex of thought and misery and anxiety and depression. I tried to look at anxiety as something that was neutral or positive, right? I used that technique where the guy was like, hey, I'm going to welcome my friend Panic. I would welcome anxiety. I remember sometimes like working out without my pre-workout where for whatever reason in the middle of a set, I'd start feeling anxious. And I remember thinking to myself, sometimes out loud in the gym to nobody, I'd be like, hey, what's up, anxiety? Like, shut up and spot me. If I'm doing a bench or something, I'm like, shut up and, grab some weights, or, like, what's up, dude? All right, spot me real quick. So it's kind of a little bit of humor to help diffuse the situation. Well, I'll end here because I've been rambling on for a hot minute. Piece of imagery that really kind of stuck with me with how to look at anxiety and what led to fear was the Will Smith movie where, oh God, what was it called? After Earth, where he's with his actual son, who plays his son in the movie, and it's a scene where he's talking about fear.
Fear is not real. The only place that fear can exist is in our thoughts of the future. It is a product of our imagination, causing us to fear things that do not at present and may not ever exist. That is near insanity, Qatar. Now, do not misunderstand me. Danger is very real, but fear is a choice.
I remember watching that and thinking like, well, anxiety is a form of fear. And so allowing anxiety to become fear is a choice. And maybe can't choose anxiety, but maybe I can choose whether or not anxiety becomes fear. And maybe anxiety is a response to danger, but fear is a choice. I don't know. But anyway, this has been a long episode. Appreciate you guys sticking with me if you are in fact still here. And thank you for tuning in. And until the next time, I'll see you then.